Hello. The topic of this video is economic policy. Please make sure you read the assigned chapter for the week. But I do want to talk a little bit about economic policy and how the federal government gets involved in our economy. So the United States has what's called a free market economy. Sometimes it's also known as capitalism. In a capitalist economy, the government's role is smaller than it would be in what's known as a command and control economy, which a lot of people associate with socialism or communism, but those are kind of different things. But a command and control economy would be where the government controls what happens within the economy, the means of production and the prices and so forth. In a free market economy, the government largely stays out of decisions regarding how much of a product should be bought, how much of a product should be sold, or what the price would be, or how the factories, how much of say, a car that a factory produces. That's not something the government does or handles in a free market. In a free market, prices are determined by what's called supply and demand. So that means as demand for a product goes up, if there's a limited supply, prices will go up as the demand goes up. But if there's a lot of supply and not as much demand, then prices go down. And so that interplay between supply and demand has a huge impact on what the prices are that we pay for whatever the product is. Now, one of the key features of a free market is that you have competition, so that you have more than one company selling a product or service. So an example in our free market in the United States is automobiles, something we know a lot about here in Southeast Michigan. Cars, there are, of course, we have the big three automakers, which are headquartered in Southeast Michigan, but you have, of course, a lot of other automakers as well, so that when someone does go to buy a car, they're not forced to go to just buy a car from one manufacturer. They can choose among different manufacturers, and there's a lot of incentive then for those companies to improve the quality of their product, to provide certain features and options and so forth, because they know there is competition in their market. If a company does things to try to prevent competition, if it goes out of its way to try to prevent other companies from competing, that can end up in a situation known as a monopoly. And a monopoly is really not a good thing in a free market, because it deprives the consumer of choice. Now, there are some natural monopolies in certain industries and certain areas of the economy, in a limited number anyways. For example, in the utility market, there are very few choices for electric and gas and so forth, but those are very tightly regulated industries at the state level. They're not regulated at the federal level, but at the state level. So there are some monopolies that exist that are regulated, but the concern of the federal government is when one company is deliberately doing things to prevent competition. Certainly a company wants to be successful in its market, but it should not be doing things to undermine its competitors by, say, artificially lowering the price of their product so that a lot of people flock to that product for that company, and then as soon as they drive the other company out of business, they jack up their prices. That's considered to be an unfair practice in a market. So that, without getting into a lot of detail on that, there are federal laws that are designed to make sure that companies do not turn into monopolies. So if two or more large companies want to merge with each other, say two cell companies want to merge, and this happens often, the federal government has to approve the merger before it goes into effect. And what the federal government is supposed to be doing, it doesn't always do this, but it's supposed to be making sure that the combination of those companies is not going to significantly reduce consumer choice. Now, so that's in terms of what our economy is. In terms of how the government gets involved, it doesn't get involved in deciding prices or how much to produce, but it does look at issues of fairness in the economy. So, for example, the federal government will not tell the Ford Motor Company, for example, what to charge for a car or what kinds of options they can put in their car. They do require that the Ford Motor Company abide by safety standards, so that every car has to have an airbag, every car has to have a seatbelt, every car has to have safety glass in the windshield. Those are things, and that cars have to have certain gas mileage. Those are federal standards that are set to ensure that there is basic fairness and what's known as equity in the market. so that you know that if you buy a car from Ford or GM or Chrysler or someone else, that it's going to have those basic things. Now, the options such as satellite radio or leather seats or whatever, that really doesn't get into the safety issues. So car companies can decide what they want to put in it for those kinds of things. But now there are some who would argue that the federal government should not even get involved for reasons of safety and equity. But the reality is, if you relied on a free market completely, as we discovered 120 years ago when we were in what was known as laissez-faire capitalism, companies don't have a financial incentive necessarily to start putting those kinds of things in their products, making sure they're safe. I mean, they're not that they're setting out to harm people, but you do need to have some basic standards for safety, just like as we've discovered with the pandemic. So the federal government does get involved to regulate safety and not just safety of products, but also safety in the workplace and other things. It also gets involved to make sure that, again, monopolies are not forming, and if they are, that they find a way to break them up or to make them more competitive. And then finally, you get into the issue of what happens when an economy like a free market goes through what's known as a recession. A recession is when the economy is slowing down, companies are having to lay people off because people aren't buying, don't have a lot of money to spend, and it can become a vicious cycle, and that drives up unemployment. And the more unemployment you have, the worse it is because, again, people don't have a lot of income and they can't buy things. And so there are different ways to handle that. One is through monetary policy, which is discussed. That is to adjust interest rates to make money if we're in a recession, to make it cheaper to borrow money to buy things, so you get more money circulating in the economy. But there's also fiscal policy, which is what I want to focus on, and that is where the federal government, largely the Congress and the president, work together to establish a budget for the federal government. And fiscal relates to budgets, and the budget has a huge impact on our economy because the federal government has a very large budget, several $1 trillion or more, that it spends each year. Obviously, a large chunk of the money that the federal government spends comes in the form of our income taxes that we pay, but there are other fees that go into the federal government. Now, the federal government does not have to have what's called a balanced budget, which means that the federal government can run a deficit. It can spend more in a given year than it's taking in taxes. There's nothing against that. And a lot of people think, well, how would that ever be a good thing? But the way to think about it is the money the federal government owes when it has to borrow money is not owed to a bank. It's owed really ultimately to us, ourselves. It's always hard to explain this, but the idea is that the federal government sells bonds, treasury bonds. So, for example, if you were to buy a bond, if you were to invest in a bond, you're essentially loaning money to the federal government, but you will get that money back plus interest when you cash in your bond. And so that's kind of the accumulation of those bonds is finances the national debt or provides the income the federal government needs to pay for programs. Now, having an overly high debt is not necessarily a good thing because it can crowd out other money. You do have to pay the debt and that sort of thing. But it's not the same thing as if an individual, for example, had a huge credit card debt and owed that money to a bank. It's not the same thing because the federal government's debt is not to a bank. It's not to an outside person. It is essentially to itself through the bonds that it sells. The federal government has never defaulted on its debt. I don't foresee a day when that would happen. Now, we have in recent years increased our debt by a lot. Several years ago, there was a large tax reduction, a tax cut that was enacted that largely went to wealthier taxpayers and corporations, although middle income taxpayers received some benefits from that as well. But a lot of there were a lot of arguments that it wasn't necessary, but it did go into effect, and that has led to an increase in the deficit in the budget. And then, of course, in the recent period, we've gone through economics crisis related to the COVID pandemic and the fact that businesses needed to shut down to deal with the safety issues involved, and that led to a large increase in unemployment. So the question is, what does the federal government do to deal with that? It can increase spending to deal with that. It can increase spending, for example, in providing direct aid to taxpayers through stimulus checks. It can provide money to states, which is where most economic activity takes place. So states do have to have balanced budgets, but they provide a lot of the services, education, healthcare, and so forth. And so something the federal government can do is provide money to the states to help them through an economic crisis. In some recessions that we've gone through, the federal government has provided money to the states to build roads, which can generate a lot of income at the state and local level. Money for schools. Schools are a major funding or a major budget item for states. For money for healthcare, certainly that's very important in a pandemic. More money for student aid and financial aid for college students. So those are all ways that the federal government can try to help out when we're in a crisis such as a recession or a depression, as we went through in the 1930s, because the federal government has that kind of money. But the idea is that once that crisis has passed, once we get through it, and hopefully through the kind of the demand side economics, where you get money into people's hands so that they can buy things and the economy can recover. Once the economy is recovered and jobs are being created again, then the federal government can pay down its deficits. In fact, 20 years ago, we got to a point where there was a zero deficit in the federal budget. That was at the end of the Clinton administration. But in the years since then, we've had deficit spending again. Again, people have different theories about it. Some argue that we should have balanced budgets, but others argue that only the federal government has that ability to spend money and borrow it at very low interest rates right now. And so it's not such a bad thing to run a deficit as long as you are using that money to stimulate the economy in some way. But there are people who disagree with that. So anyway, I wanted to get into some of that. It's a lot of detail to talk about. If you have any questions, please email me. Make sure you read chapter 13 very carefully, particularly the discussion of Keynesianism, which is in that chapter, and then also some of the issues of monetary policy. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great week.